What is up, guys? In today's video we're going to be talking about the Spire AR and whether or not it is worth using in season 3 because it was recently unvaulted in the newest update. As always, if you guys do enjoy this video, find it helpful, informative, or interesting, remember to give it a like, subscribe if you'd like to see more, comment down below which weapon is your favorite currently for kind of like medium to long range, and if you guys would like to use my code in the shop when getting anything, it is Evolve Jake, just like my channel name is, and it is underneath the webcam at all times. So a lot of people were excited to see the Spire AR return. And this is a fan favorite item and was the meta long range weapon in chapter 6 season 3. But oftentimes what makes a weapon good is not only the stats of the weapon itself, but also what else is in the loot pool at the time as far as like the weapons it's going to be competing against. And then also the mobility items that are there as well, because that will often dictate how fights play out in zero build. Like the mobility items change the pacing and then change the way how fights play out in zero build. And then obviously if a weapon has like a weaker roster of weapons to compete against, it might shine in a way that it wouldn't if it was competing in like a really stacked loot pool full of like really good weapons. So the main ranged weapon currently this season is going to be the Ranger pistol. So that's what I'm going to be comparing the Spire AR to, because most people really like the Ranger pistol and the differences between them are super clear. The Spire AR clearly has more damage. If you compare equal rarities, it's about 6 or 7 more damage than the Ranger pistol at that rarity, which is a pretty good amount of damage for a spray weapon. And it also will have less damage fall off at range since it is an AR, and then the Ranger pistol is a pistol. On the flip side though, the pistol has a noticeably better fire rate at 6.1 compared to the Spire's 4.2. So you basically are trading damage for fire rate between these two weapons. And as far as like weapon stats go, those are the two stats that really affect the damage output of a weapon. And those are the stats that most people kind of care about most. And this is actually what results in the Ranger pistol having a noticeably better DPS at about 20 or 30 damage. The fire rate advantage it has and then the damage disadvantage it has just doesn't, match up well to actually make them balanced. The Ranger pistol is clearly better DPS if you compare equal rarities. And this 20 or 30 damage per second difference might not sound like a lot, but just a quick example of how kind of drastic this is. The gray Ranger pistol has a DPS of 165, while the purple Spire AR has a DPS of 164. So I thought this was pretty crazy. I thought it was going to be like somewhat close and somewhat comparable, but the only Spire AR that has a higher DPS than the gray pistol is the legendary version, which is just like, I feel like a clear example of how mismatched these weapons actually are when they are in the same loot pool. And oftentimes you're going to be having better rarities of the Ranger pistol, and so your advantage is going to be even larger. And DPS can be like a nice stat to get a general picture of how things are, but I don't like when people treat DPS as like an end-all be-all, especially with the third-person weapons in Fortnite, because bloom can be such a huge factor in whether or not you're even getting close to that DPS. Like hypothetically, if you had a weapon with an amazing DPS but also a lot of bloom, you would be missing a lot of shots in a fight, and then you wouldn't even be getting close to that on-paper DPS. Like the stat assumes you're hitting every shot. But this is also another bad spot for the Spire AR because it has already noticeably lower DPS, as I touched on, but of these two weapons, it also has more bloom, meaning you're probably going to miss more shots with the Spire AR unless you're tap firing, which obviously tanks your DPS because then you're not shooting as fast. So this is probably the most clear-cut example or clear-cut way to put that the Ranger pistol is just the better weapon. It is absolutely better. It has significantly better accuracy while also just having, more killing potential because the DPS is higher. If there was more of a mismatch here, like let's say the more accurate version had worse DPS, then maybe there would be an argument to make that like, it's a bit worse on paper, but that accuracy is going to make up for it. But that's not the case here. The lower DPS weapon is actually the least accurate one. And so you're getting less close to your theoretical DPS with the one that already has a lower number to begin with. So I think the Ranger pistol is just the clear cut, better choice. And it's also way more enjoyable to use in fights, I think, because of that accuracy. Third person weapons in Fortnite, if you want to minimize bloom and maximize your accuracy, usually you're going to want to crouch, you're going to want to sit still, and then maybe you're going to want to tap fire depending on the range, right? And the more bloom a weapon has, the more you have to think about or do those things, and this kind of limits how you can play fights, and it limits your movement in fights. Whereas the Ranger pistol is very accurate, And even if you are just shooting it as fast as possible while moving, it's still a very accurate weapon, and the size of the reticle is something that you can put on an enemy player, and most of your reticle is going to be occupied by an enemy, and so you have a really high probability of hitting shots, right? Even when you're trying to make the weapon as inaccurate as you can, it's still really accurate. And so you're very free to just play how you want to play. If you want to strafe, if you want to jump around, if you want to move while shooting, if you want to full spam, you can do all that. Whereas with the Spire AR, you might have to think like, I need to sit still in this fight, or I need to tap fire at this range. And that, not like, the weapon is harder to use for an outcome that like is worse on paper anyway. So I think that it's just very clear cut. The Ranger pistol is better. It's more accurate. It's easier to use. It's better DPS. It's basically everything you could want. There is a few kind of minor differences or advantages the Spire AR does have. Obviously range, as I touched on, but the magazine size is also going to be a clear advantage for the Spire AR, and it is a drastic advantage. The Spire has 50 rounds in the mag while the Ranger has 17. But the reload speed is offset too. The reload speed of the Ranger is incredibly fast, and so you have a lower mag, but you replenish it quick, whereas the Spire has a large mag, but you reload slowly. And so in practice, I feel like the advantage a larger magazine has is kind of not realized very often, because you would think, you know, not needing to reload as much in a fight would be a good thing. But in most fights, it shouldn't matter too much, because the Ranger pistol does reload quick. You're not really out of the fight if you want to reload. You know, you can easily dip back into cover, reload, and then, you know, immediately start returning fire. And the downtime in between you needing to reload and being able to shoot again isn't that big of a deal. And in most kind of fights where you're using your spray weapon in kind of medium to long range, you're playing cover and the enemy is playing cover. So you don't want to just be sitting there spraying your weapon continuously anyways. Like, sure, if you wanted to, you could, but oftentimes that's going to be a bad play to make. And I know there's probably going to be comments of people saying, well, you mainly play solos, and so the mag size isn't a problem. In squads, it could be. And there's some, you know, merit there, but also you shouldn't be exposed to all 4 players for a prolonged period of time to the point where the magazine really matters. If you're playing cover and you're playing movement, and you're doing all that stuff well, you don't want to be exposed to the enemy team for a really long time, and you certainly don't want to be exposed to all 4 players. So if the Ranger pistol had a really slow or a really clunky reload, I think the mag size would be more of a problem. But since the reload speed is very quick, I think regardless of game mode you're playing, it doesn't put you out of the fight for that long, and you can take advantage of this in times where you need to be taking cover anyways. If you're just standing out peeking for an incredibly long period of time, you're going to be an easy target. And this season has something like the heavy impact sniper, which can immediately put you down. The bounce pistol, you know, can do a lot of damage very quick. And then even the burst AR can take advantage of somebody that's peeking for way too long really easily. So I think the magazine size advantage that the Spire AR has, it's nice, but it's not as big of a deal as I feel like some people might make it out to be. And then also in the past, some of the ways that this was helpful was like spraying out enemy cover. But in the Overwatch update, Fortnite drastically reduced the health of every structure in zero build. So if somebody's sitting behind a tree, it doesn't really do you much good to try to spray that tree out unless it's already weak or unless you're doing it with several people. But I feel like the fact that every structure got increased health makes the magazine size, I feel like, less of a big deal because those structures feel more permanent. And then also cars. This was another reason why the Spire Arrow was really good, is because you could deal with cars really easily. The mag size made it easy to spray the car out and then continue shooting the player once you blew their car up. But cars aren't as big of a deal anymore. Like, there's less cars on this map, and it just feels like the impact cars have on the game is significantly lower this season than it was in Chapter 6, Season 3. And so, sure, if you had to destroy a car, the Spire Arrow would probably be a better choice, but that situation isn't like as prevalent as it used to be. And then also, one other kind of advantage you would think the Spire AR had, since it has more damage, would be the headshot damage. But the headshot damage between these weapons is basically equal because the Ranger pistol actually has a higher headshot multiplier. The Ranger pistol's headshot multiplier is 1.8, and the Spire's is 1.5, and this kind of makes up for the damage advantage the Spire had. So when it comes to headshots, a blue Spire has a headshot damage of 56, and then a blue Ranger pistol has a headshot damage of 54. So it's a little more for the Spire, but they're basically the same. This isn't as much of an advantage. And one kind of difference between this season and Super, when the Spire dominated, is in Chapter 7, they added the ability to aim down sight while in air. That was not a thing last time the Spire AR was in the core loot pool, and that drastically changes how fights play in zero build, and it drastically changes how fights play around like mobility, or how mobility is used in fights. Before, you'd shockwave at somebody, maybe hip fire in the air while you're on your way to them, and then, you know, land and fight them. But now when you shockwave onto somebody, you're probably aim down sight in air, trying to get shots on them as you get there, and then swap to your shotgun. And the shock rocks are another example of this. A lot of fights are just kind of jumping around with the shock rocks. And if you get a good opening damage on somebody and they have rocks and jump away, you're probably going to want to shock rock yourself and chase them. And again, the accuracy advantage the Ranger pistol has is incredibly noticeable in these in-air situations. The jumping accuracy of the Spire is not great. You're going to have a lot of bloom. You're not going to be consistently landing shots. And those kind of situations are often make or break this season, especially if you're fighting somebody good. If I'm fighting a decent player and I get good damage on them and they start running away with rocks, I don't want them to reset the fight. I don't want them to heal and then maybe get timing on me later on. And so I want to pursue that kill and get them out of the game. Even team game modes, if you have one guy running from you, you don't want that guy to like get away and reboot. And the way mobility is used in the aim down sight in air feature that was added in Chapter 7, I think drastically changes how fights play in zero build, and it makes the Spire AR way less appealing than the Ranger pistol. And as I've touched on throughout this video, there's already, lots of other reasons why the Ranger pistol is more appealing, because it's just the better weapon for eliminating players. Also, long range, sure, the Spire Rifle does have more range than the Ranger pistol. I'd argue a lot of times in Fortnite, like really long range fights aren't that big of a deal because of the overshield and because mobility. People aren't just going to sit there and let you eliminate them if you're fighting like 100 meters away. But if hypothetically in that situation, the Spire would be better than the Ranger pistol. But I think the other ARs in the loot pool are also just better than the Spire, especially the Burst Rifle. The Burst Rifle is incredibly good. I feel like it's been solid all season, and it did recently get buffed. And so if you don't like the Ranger pistol's lack of range, like if you feel like that's like a real problem and you wanted something with more range, I think the Burst would be the better choice over the Spire. Like the way the Burst forces you to play around cover, I feel like is a safer playstyle. It's incredibly good at range, and the accuracy is really solid now. Even when jumping, you can somewhat reliably land shots in a way that you can't with the Spire. So I think the Ranger pistol is still the clear-cut best kind of medium to long-range weapon. But even if you did want something with more range and you care about that, I think the Burst is going to be better than the Spire AR. So I really don't think it's worth using in Chapter 7 Season 3. But that is going to be it for this video. As always, if you guys did find this to be helpful, informative, or interesting, remember to give it a like, subscribe if you would like to see more. And I will see you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching.